So many churches today are involved with this. I went back and did some research to try to figure out where did it come from and where is the direction it's trying to take the churches of the world and the inhabitants of the world. You know, you can do this with almost any subject. What I did with spiritual formation, for example, communism. If you want to know where communism came from, research it. It didn't begin with Nikolai Lenin and the Soviet Union or Russia. Actually, it didn't even begin with Karl Marx and the Communist Manifesto in the 1800s. It began several hundred years before that on the reductions in Paraguay with the Guarani Indians. And those reductions were run and operated by the Jesuit order, and they perfected the principles of communism on those reductions from 1600 to 1750. And then those principles that they learned from those reductions, they then applied them to nations. And of course, the first nation to implement those was Russia. But that's where communism came from. So you can take any subject and you can find out where it came from and where it's going. Spiritual formation. Where have you been? This is taken from a book I'd encourage everybody to get. It's written by a man named Rick Howard. He is now retired, I believe. He was a Seventh-day Adventist minister for over 3 decades. And he wrote a book called The Omega Rebellion, in which he talks about and he uses this cryptic term, Omega, that was used by Ellen White around the turn of the century when she talked about the alpha of deadly heresies that was being promoted among Seventh-day Adventists. And that came, of course, through the writings of a doctor. Does anybody remember his name? John Kellogg. That's right. John Kellogg wrote a book called Living Temple, in which the principles he outlined there, Ellen White said this was the alpha of deadly heresies. And she said the Omega would come, and she trembled for God's people. Well, Rick Howard, in his book, The Omega Rebellion, pages 26 and 27, he talks about spiritual formation. He says this: the concept of God, as revealed to Loyola in these mystical experiences, revealed a God who is pantheistic in nature, his person existing in the things of his creation. Loyola developed what is called today his spiritual exercises, which contain all the teachings from which modern spiritual formation was constructed. From these spiritual exercises comes the most important practice of the examen, a daily practice of prayer and meditation essential to spiritual formation. So according to this Seventh-day Adventist pastor, Rick Howard, spiritual formation had its beginnings in the spiritual exercises of Ignatius Loyola. Now, for those who may not know, Ignatius Loyola was the founder of an order of the Catholic Church called the Jesuits, or what he called it, the Society of Jesus. Now, when you analyze the principles of the Jesuit order, you recognize that the Society of Jesus is the antithesis of what Jesus Christ stood for. Because the Society of Jesus, or the Jesuits, would use lying, murder, deception, any and all kinds of wickedness to carry out their plans of world domination. So Ignatius Loyola was the founder of the Jesuit order. In the book Great Controversy, Ellen White talks about the founding of the Jesuit order, and it's in Great Controversy 234 and 235. Loyola, again, was the head of a new order in the Catholic Church in the 1530s. The timing of their founding is very instructive. The Protestant Reformation was flourishing. The papacy was crumbling. It's very important that we understand the historical roots of the Jesuits. Loyola's Jesuits were created to flip those tables, to shred the Protestant Reformation, and to exalt the papacy again. Now here's the statement in Great Controversy, pages 234 and 235. I want you to notice this part. You can read as much of that as you want. I'm going to read just from here down. These are the two aims of the Jesuit order. Vowed to perpetual poverty and humility, it was their studied aim to secure wealth and power, to be devoted to the overthrow of Protestantism and the reestablishment of the papal supremacy. Now, friend, as you and I look across the landscape of the world today, and we find, for example, in the United States, for Pope Benedict XVI to be able to come to America, to be wined and dined in the White House, and to be glorified as the great man of peace throughout the world, we can readily see that Protestantism is in a free fall in the United States of America. Well, that would tell us one thing based on this quote. That would tell us that the Jesuit order is dominating America today. Amen. Dominating it. Another case in point and illustration is that back in 1605, when King James I came to the English throne, King James I was establishing laws that the Catholic Church did not like in England. So the Catholic Church and the Jesuit order devised a plan whereby they were going to blow up the House of Parliament November 5th, 1605. Well, there was a man, a Roman Catholic man, his name was Guy Fawkes. And Guy Fawkes was down in the basement right below the English Parliament buildings. And down under there, in that basement, he had 36 kegs of gunpowder. And so when all the Parliament was going to meet November 5, 1605, with King James, the man whose name goes on the King James Bible, Guy Fawkes was going to light all of that gunpowder. And he was going to blow the Parliament buildings into eternity with all the people that were there. Well, it just so happened that English authorities were made aware of this gunpowder, and Guy Fawkes was made known. Guy Fawkes eventually was hung. A Jesuit priest was also killed for his part in the plot to blow up the Parliament of England and King James I. November 5, 1605. Well, you know, for the next few hundred years, every November 5th, there was an effigy made of the Pope, and he was burned throughout the whole country of England. This went on for a few hundred years, every year, in honor of November 5th, 1605. But you know what, folk, today? They no longer burn the Pope in effigy today. You know what they do? They burn Guy Fawkes. So that now, November 5, every year in England is known as Guy Fawkes Day. So the English have completely forgotten the history of why every November 5th they burn this man in effigy, when in actuality it should be the Pope himself. But again, This further illustrates what Ellen White is describing here in Great Controversy, pages 234 and 235. Protestantism is going down in England, and the papacy is rising up. The Jesuits are very, very powerful in England and in the British Isles today. It says, under this blameless exterior, the most criminal and deadly purposes were often concealed. It was a fundamental principle of the order that the end justifies the means. By this code, lying, theft, perjury, assassination were not only pardonable, but commendable when they served the interests of the church. Under various disguises, the Jesuits worked their way into offices of state, climbing up to be the counselors of kings and shaping the policy of nations. See, friend, through the spiritual formation of the spiritual exercises, people were led to become, as it were, living cadavers. People who no longer would think for themselves, but would be told exactly what they were supposed to do by a spiritual mentor. That spiritual mentor became God to those who were engaged in the spiritual exercises of Ignatius Loyola. Just one illustration of this point, not only Guy Fawkes, who was willing to blow up Parliament in 1605, you take the man who pulled the trigger that killed Abraham Lincoln in April of 1865, John Wilkes Booth. John Wilkes Booth was a tool of Rome, and he did exactly as he was told. Another man, Edward Smith. Edward Smith was a famous sea captain who had traveled the waters of the Atlantic for 26 years. He was working for the Jesuit order through his profession. And before he got on board the ship, the RMS Titanic, he was told, you need to sink this ship. So that today, encyclopedias, you can read them, they say that somehow this man's tremendous naval capabilities seem to have left him the night that the Titanic sunk. Well, did they leave him? Or was he told to do something and his mind was so hell-bent on carrying out the orders of his superior, he couldn't do anything else? That's called cadaver obedience. And through the spiritual exercises and through spiritual formation, anybody who has engaged in that becomes a willing tool of a spiritual mentor. The Jesuits and Loyola were at war with the Reformation and its teachings. They hated the Bible that exposed them. They refused to be in submission to Jesus Christ. With these points clearly in mind, what then was the basis for the Jesuit teachings? To whom would a Jesuit be in submission? How would they get to that point of submission? Well, if they're not in submission to Christ, they then have become in submission to their mentor, to their leader, to the one who they call their spiritual supervisor. That's who they would be in submission to. This is fascinating to me. This is from a book written by a famous Seventh-day Adventist attorney named Lewis Walton. Lewis Walton has written many wonderful books. One was called Omega, that he wrote back in the early 1980s, a tremendous book that talks about the omega of apostasy amongst us as a people. Tremendous book. He wrote a follow-up book called Omega 2. And on pages 150 and 151, he makes this absolutely startling statement. Listen carefully. He said Loyola's whole religious life centered around his meditation or his exercises. He is said to have believed that he had revelations from God every day. He authored a volume that is still in print entitled The Spiritual Exercises of Ignatius Loyola, a series of meditations by which one is supposed to purge the soul and find oneness with God. He spends hours in mystical meditation under the control of a director, and within a month, his mind has begun to accept the concept of absolute submission. Now, friend, be real clear on this. When somebody is involved with the spiritual exercises of Ignatius Loyola, they are involved in spiritual formation. They come under the control of a spiritual director. And they are brought to accept the concept of absolute submission. Now, this is all from Lewis Walton's book. Submission to whom? Who are they submitting themselves to if they are involved in these exercises? Now, Malachi Martin says that after going through the rigors of the spiritual exercises, each man emerged from that weeks-long regimen as a spiritual fighter completely won over to warfare. Warfare to do what? To go out and fight in wars and battles on battlefields and, get into tanks? No. Listen to what Malachi Martin says. An entirely obedient servant of who? Of the Pope. Ignatius Loyola's purposes in the spiritual exercises or spiritual formation was to bring an individual human being to absolute submission to the Pope. To the Pope. Now, folks, none of us would ever dream of getting involved in spiritual formation, would we? None of us would ever even consider taking the spiritual exercises of Ignatius Loyola. Would we? If any of us, not knowing, if any of us are serious about the fact that there's truly a great controversy going on, and that we want to be on the side of Jesus Christ, and we want to be a part of the heavenly people that go to the sea of glass, we would never even consider such a thing as this. Now, to summarize thus far what we've seen, the point of the spiritual exercises or spiritual formation is to empty one's mind in meditation. Once this is achieved, the individual is ready to be in total submission to someone else, but not God. The goal in these exercises is to become a totally obedient slave of the Pope. Of the Pope. Now, if you remember, in fact, let's go back to it. Rick Howard said that Ignatius Loyola's mystical experiences were pantheistic in nature. So he was involved in pantheism, that God was in everything. Now, isn't that interesting that pantheism is not something that just Loyola was involved with, but John Harvey Kellogg was too. And Ellen White called that the alpha of deadly heresy. Could the omega, because when you think about it, the alpha of deadly heresies and the omega Well, that's the first letter of the Greek alphabet and the last letter of the Greek alphabet. So within the deadly heresies that would confront God's people, there would be some similarities, wouldn't there? Is it possible, folks? Is it possible that the spiritual exercises or spiritual formation could be amongst us as a people today? Is that possible? That there could be people who we go to church with, who are leaders, who are in conference offices, in union offices, that are actually a part of this?
Yes.
Totally subservient, not to Jesus Christ, but to the Pope of Rome.
Bill, it goes further than that. It's used in business.
Used in business.
Everywhere. Everywhere.
Everywhere. Everywhere. The concept of God, Rick Howard's book again, excuse me. The concept of God is revealed to Loyola in these mystical experiences, reveal a God who is pantheistic in nature. Loyola developed what is called today his spiritual exercises, which contain all the teachings from which modern spiritual formation was constructed. If this is something that can be everywhere, as you're saying, and what was your name?
Vern.
And I believe it is, Vern. This concept where you are to accept what your superior says. If your superior says that this right here is green, then it's green. Because your spiritual mentor says it's green. Now, folks, what that demands, it sounds ridiculous. But the man who captained the Titanic, he was told the ship has got to go down. Whether that went across everything that he believed as a naval sea captain, that ship had to go down. Why? Because he was in cadaver obedience to the Pope. Friends, this goes everywhere. We see it all over the place. We have to accept something simply because somebody else tells us that it's so.
Bill, would this be a form of hypnotism?
Absolutely it is. It's the taking control, Rob, of one mind by another. That's what the spiritual exercises are. And that's what hypnosis is. It's taking control of somebody else's mind. I think, Rob, the only real difference would be in hypnosis, a person's just in a state of basically non-existence, where they're having things communicated to them and they really don't know. But with this, Rob, they know. They know. And the person is willing to accept another's concept of reality because they are now that person's mentor or spiritual guide.
It's a form of
Psychological hypnotism.
What about taking it farther with the CIA and MK Ultra, mind control?
Steve, say it again.
MK Ultra, mind control.
That, Steve, the MK Ultra mind control, that, Steve, of course, is something that is involved with drugs,
Right.
where they actually use drugs to control and alter a person's thinking. This right here, Steve, that's part of the MK Ultra, because let's face it, MK Ultra came in through the German scientists that were working for the Third Reich in Germany. And when the Third Reich was toppling, these people who had done mind research in Germany, mostly on Jewish babies, they took all that they had learned, Steve. Some of those German scientists went east to Russia, but many of them came west to the United States. And they continued their research on how to gain control of human minds. MK Ultra, Steve, they used shock waves. They used electrical impulses to actually create multiple personalities in people when very young, so that they could control them that way. This, Steve, with spiritual formation and spiritual exercises, you are taking adults who are willing to sell themselves to a life of submission to their spiritual mentor. So while it's along the same line, Steve, there are distinct differences.
Yeah. Or it could come down through the SS. A lot of them were connected with the spiritual exercise.
No doubt, sir. Your name?
Bill. Faye.
What is it?
Bill.
Bill. That's easy. So there's no question, Bill, that the SS used that in Germany. Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, Hitler said about Himmler, he said, in Himmler we have our Ignatius of Loyola. And the SS, Bill, was actually fashioned after the Jesuit order itself.
Amen. That's what I was thinking.
Yeah. So this kind of, and see, the only resistance to the spiritual exercises and spiritual formation, which is in every facet of life today, the only resistance to it is the indwelling of Christ in the mind through faith in His righteousness. That is the only power that can resist this satanic sorcery.
So
It's the only one.
Bill, you're
Yeah.
saying that, again, you just said it, if we're not in the Word of God daily and on Sabbath, the most dangerous place to be right now would be in any church that is teaching this.
No question. No
The
question.
most dangerous place.
Absolutely. No question. Because
So it's highly important to be in the Word in the home church, or to fellowship like we are today, in with like-minded.
absolutely. See, it's like what Jesus said to Mary and Martha in Luke chapter 10, 38 to 42. And I'll get your hand in a minute, ma'am. I don't want your arm to get tired. See, when Jesus came to Bethany in Luke 10, 38 to 42, as soon as He walked in, Martha headed out to the kitchen because Jesus and the disciples were hungry. And so she's out there, you can just see her grabbing pots and, cutting food and, doing all kinds of things. And she looks around and she's probably going, where's Mary? I need her to help me. And Mary wasn't there. And so Martha went out and she saw Mary sitting at Jesus' feet. And she said, Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to serve alone? Tell her, basically she said, tell her to get out there and help me. I'm pulling my hair out trying to get a meal ready for you guys. And Jesus said, Martha, Martha, you are careful and troubled about many things, but one thing is needful. And Mary has chosen that good part which will not be taken away from her. Mary realized. And your name again? Van?
Vern.
Vern. Okay. It would start with a V. Mary realized, Vern, that her only source of power was the words of Christ. She had experienced the words of Christ in her own life to drive the 7 demons out of her that controlled her in her immorality. And she realized, Vern, that was her only source of protection against the forces in that world. And it's the same for us. We can get careful and troubled about many things, but we've got to be spending time, Vern, in prayer and in memorizing Scripture. We have to be. Otherwise, Vern, this will overtake us. This will overtake us. Now, ma'am, you had a comment, and then Rob. And your name?
It's Jamie.
Jamie, go ahead.
How close to this is NLP?
It's very similar, Jamie. Very similar. Again, Jamie, what you've got is with MK Ultra, with spiritual exercises, and then with NLP. What you have, Jamie, it's an attempt to hypnotize, to take control of another person's mind. NLP, you do that, Jamie, through things like, what do they call it, like imaging, or if you're talking to somebody and they're pulling the NLP thing with you, if you're sitting like this, they will do the same thing. They will image what you're doing.
Mirroring.
Mirroring. Okay, mirroring. So it's very similar, Jamie. Very similar. Okay, Rob.
Bill, I was going to ask you if you would repeat what Vern suggested for the video. I'm not sure if the video picked up what Vern
I'm
suggested.
Maybe
Heard
it
it loud.
Basically, what Vern was talking about, he said, you said the most dangerous place for a human being to be in would be in a church
Yeah, that's teaching.
that's teaching this. Because, and see, basically, the essence of this has been taught in Adventism, tragically, for over 100 years. And that is to say, you trust your leaders. You follow what your leaders say. You obey your leaders because they're leaders. You
Cursed
know,
be the
friend,
man that trusteth in man and man. Yeah.
absolutely. Vern, you know, it's fascinating, and I appreciate your comment about that. You know, 1888 with Jones and Wagner. You know why most Seventh-day Adventists opposed and rejected the messages of A.T. Jones and E.J. Wagner? It's because George Butler and Uriah Smith didn't agree with them. That was why. In Adventism in the 1880s, 1890s, most Seventh-day Adventists opposed the message that Ellen White said the latter rain started to fall, that this was the message that was to lighten the earth with the glory of the character of God. Most people watched how George Butler, the General Conference president, and Uriah Smith, the editor of the Adventist Review, they watched, how are these men responding to the message of Jones and Wagner? And when they saw that they opposed it, so did most of the people. It's the same concept. It's the same concept. And Ellen White said the same spirit that was in existence in 1888 was the same spirit that crucified Christ. This is the spirit that crucifies Christ. Right here. John Harvey Kellogg taught pantheism under the alpha of deadly heresies. Ellen White said he has lost sight of the distinguishing truths for this time. Anybody involved in pantheism or the spiritual exercises has no clue what the truths are for this time. Kellogg didn't. Nor would anybody who is involved in spiritual formation. Kellogg's pantheistic teachings, claiming simply that God was in everything, was a direct shot at the heavenly sanctuary where God was enthroned. God is everywhere. What need is there for a temple in heaven wherein for God to dwell? Ellen White referred to Kellogg's teachings as the alpha of deadly heresies. She trembled because Omega would come and would seek the destruction of God's remnant.
Bill,
Yes?
where did that statement come from?
This?
Yeah, whereabouts in Ellen White did she say that?
That statement, this right here where I said Ellen
Yes.
White referred to Kellogg's teachings as the alpha of
Yes.
deadly heresies, If you go, and your name, sir?
Keith.
Keith. If you go, Keith, to first selected messages, it's right around 195 to 205, right in there, that's where Ellen White talks about Kellogg, his book, The Living Temple, containing the alpha of deadly heresies. It's right there.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I would greatly encourage anybody who is interested in studying the Alpha and Omega of deadly heresies to get Lewis Walton's original book called Omega, that was written right around, published 1980, 1981. Tremendous book. So Rick Howard, pages 26 and 27. Said that pantheism was the essence of Loyola's spiritual exercises, which is where spiritual formation comes from. And then Malachi Martin said anybody involved in this is going to become a warrior for the Pope. Ignatius Loyola, the Jesuit founder, pantheism, spiritual formation, all go together. And as you folks have so well brought out, it's permeated everywhere, Vern. NLP is a part of that. Jamie, was it? Okay, Jamie. And Steve, your concept about MK Ultra as well. They're all connected into that pod. Loyola's understanding of God was pantheistic. From his understanding of God, Loyola derived his spiritual exercises, which is the foundation for the spiritual formation movement of today. But what does Loyola, spiritual exercises, and spiritual formation have to do with Adventism and Omega? Well, Rick Howard, in his book, The Omega Rebellion, page 136, he quotes this. I want to read it to you. He says, please prayerfully consider this quotation from a General Conference bulletin informing the church at large of its plans to implement. I'm going to go back and read that again. Prayerfully consider this quotation from a General Conference bulletin informing the church at large of its plans to implement the teaching of spiritual formation around the world. And you know what that just said? Yeah. The Seventh-day Adventist denomination would bring spiritual formation that originated with the Jesuit order and Ignatius Loyola, the teachings of which, if followed, would bring people to obedience to the Pope of Rome, which in essence is to bring a group of people to embracing the beast and his mark and his number. Seventh-day Adventist denomination would implement the teaching of spiritual formation around the world. Now you say, well, let's see, did that happen? Let's see, this is 2011, September 2011.
10 years ago.
What, did that happen a month ago? This must be breaking news, Bill, because I've never heard about it. Was it 2 weeks ago? Or was this something you just heard about before you came out here to Washington? Let me read it to you. The Adventist World Church created the International Board of Ministerial and Theological Education in September 2001. That's 10 years ago.
Was that the place and timing where Wilson was involved with this type of thing?
Cindy, we'll get to that. Your question was, I'm guessing you're referring to the current General Conference
Yeah.
president?
Yeah.
I'm going to make reference to that momentarily.
Okay.
Ted Wilson's involvement. Well, Cindy, Ted Wilson was a part of this board.
He was
The
a coach.
current General Conference president, as a vice president of the General Conference, was a member of this board of ministerial and theological education, designed to provide overall guidance and standards. Now look at this, folks. To the professional training of pastors, evangelists, theologians, teachers, chaplains, and other denominational employees involved in ministerial and religious formation or spiritual formation in each of the church's 13 regions around the world. Yes, sir. Your name?
David,
David, please.
the only thing I see really missing here is it says a general conference bulletin, and we'd really like to know the date and all of that on that bulletin.
Let's see, David, if I can find it for you.
You can do it later, if you got that information.
Unfortunately, David, the place where I got it, okay, here it is. In fact, David, here's the exact quote. It's from Adventist News Network. Okay? Adventist News Network, February 3, 2004. The website you can go to is www.adventist.org. The title of it is called Church Congregations Increase Focus on Spiritual Formation.
Thank you.
You got it.
Can you repeat that?
Yes, ma'am.
Adventist News.
It's from the Adventist News Network. February 3, 2004. The website www.adventist.org. The feature is Church Congregations Increase Focus on Spiritual Formation.
Thank you.
Now, think about for a minute the ramifications of this statement. Who in the Seventh-day Adventist denomination would be trained in the spiritual exercises of Ignatius Loyola? Who would be trained in that?
All the professionals,
Pastors, evangelists, theologians, teachers, chaplains. You know, folks,
Bill, Eugene just brought this to our attention because he sometimes sends me YouTubes from the English-speaking churches in Romania.
yes,
They do the same thing over there. They've got this going on everywhere. And the problem, yeah, all the regions, and people don't realize that it's all regions, even across the seas.
around the
Around the
world.
world. And so many of us, and I sound like a broken wheel on this one, I think, but so many of us have really appreciated and trusted Walter Weiss. And he's calling people to return their tithes into the church. Don't worry what happens to your money there. It's none of your business. Put the glue on your butt and sit down there, and don't matter what they're preaching, just stay. And that's his whole segment on this total transformation. This last set he did. And a lot of us have really appreciated him up until this point. It's like question marks are huge now. Like, okay, so now you've got us trusting you. Now you're taking us back to the structure. We're trying to. So that's my comment on that one.
Appreciate
It's
that,
your money,
Vaughn.
it's your business.
Vaughn, again, 13 regions around the world.
Yeah.
Around the world. You know, I get letters from people all over the world, and they would tell me that Adventists, Conference Adventists in Zambia or Kenya or different places, the Philippines, that they would get books like The Secret Terrorist or Sunday Law, Enemy Unmasked, and they would burn them. And I'm going, burn them? That's got truth in it. I don't know of anything. Nobody has ever come out and said, Bill, what you wrote here is wrong. You can't back that up. Nobody's ever done that. But they would burn the books? So why would a Seventh-day Adventist burn the Secret Terrorist or the Enemy Unmasked or the National Sunday Law? Why would they burn them? Because they have taken spiritual formation and they have become an obedient foot soldier of whom? The Pope himself. The Pope himself. Pope, this part right here. Why is it that pastors and evangelists today, you go to ask a question, or you would dare to question something they have said, and they look at you as though you're divisive or you're critical?
Right.
Why can't a person in a position, why can't they accept criticism? Why can't they be called to give an account? Why? Because their authority, they are absolutely obedient to the Pope, and everybody under them is to be absolutely obedient to them.
To protect their jobs.
Protect their job, Chris. Yes, sir.
Bill,
Yes, sir.
I have a friend, she's well up into her 70s. She goes to places like gun shows, knife shows, things like that, and hands out her books for free. And she had a lady come back to her one day and she said, well, my son is a Jesuit priest, and he read the book and he said, he should have told you a lot more. There's a lot more than that. Everything that it said is true. I thought that was a real good testimonial.
The thing that comes to my mind is it seemed like there would be some rebellion in the workers. You know,
The mind control
the
bill.
lack of advice sneaks up on them some way, but
Protecting their
it seemed
jobs.
like there would be some honest souls that would.
Bill,
Have they not figured this out?
there are groups, Bill, across this planet.
I'm just being devil's advocate. I'm
Sure, sure. Bill, wherever I go, I was recently in Korea, back in July, a month and a half ago. In April, I was in Australia and New Zealand. The year before that, I was in the Philippines. I've been to Africa, the Middle East, Europe. Bill, throughout this entire world, there are Seventh-day Adventists just like this group here today.
Amen.
And they are meeting in groups like this today, Bill, because they have dared to question the authority of a leader, whether it be a pastor, a evangelist, a theologian. They have dared to question what they were teaching because it was not in line with Seventh-day Adventist belief. And that is why, Bill, there are groups of people like this throughout the world.
Amen.
Folk, I was given a book that is, and this is no lie, it's at least 2 to 2.5 inches thick. It is a commentary on the book of Revelation put out by a theologian and a scholar at Andrews University. The man is Eastern European. His last name is Stefanovic, Ranko Stefanovic. Folk, the man is a doctor of theology at Andrews University. He goes through a verse-by-verse study of the book of Revelation. Deeply articulate, very scholarly. He comes to Revelation chapter 13, where it talks about the beast that comes up out of the sea that claims to be God, claims it can forgive sins, persecutes God's people, and rules for 1,260 years through the Dark Ages. All of a sudden, this deeply intellectual man from Andrews University becomes tongue-tied. Immediately, he cannot express himself anymore. And he is unable to identify the first beast of Revelation chapter 13 as the papacy. I read through everything he said and I thought, why can't he say who the first beast is?
Protecting his job.
Folks,
Well, Bob
this
Trez
man
gives
has
a background
become-
of this guy, and he comes from some wild background. I mean, he's been into Tibetan and all kinds of stuff. So if you look at his background,
Bill, ultimately, this is all the background that I need to know about Ranko Stefanovic.
Amen.
but
He has been
you wouldn't
involved-
be impressed with anything he said.
Yeah. Well, the rest of the book is very good. Very good. Folk, have you ever wondered why in Adventist churches you sit in the pulpit Sabbath after Sabbath after Sabbath, we don't hear about who the Antichrist is in it?
Right.
Why is it in the Adventist Review, Bill Johnson back in 1995 in the insert called Saints' Victory at the End of Time could say, anybody who believes that the first beast of Revelation 13 is the papacy, Bill Johnson in the review said, that person is narrow-minded and a bigot. How could he say that? How could he say that?
He's calling himself a liar.
Infiltrator.
Friends, we have people that have embraced the spiritual exercises and spiritual formation who are now doing warfare for the papacy. And then we look at this. I had a good friend of mine in Loma Linda, California. He said he tried about 4 weeks ago at the ASI meeting that was held in Sacramento, California. He said, I saw the General Conference president by himself, and I went over to him to ask him to explain this symbol. And my friend asked the president, he said, Sir, we used to be 3 angels flying in the midst of heaven. He said, why are we now 3 wavy lines? And the president hemmed and hawed and said, well, this is our emblem now and this is what we're going to go by. Friends, this is not what Seventh-day Adventists are to go by.
Amen.
This represents the 3 wavy lines of the BEM document that was signed in Lima, Peru in 1982. This is the ecumenical baptism, Eucharist, and ministry. That's what this is. This has nothing to do with the 3 angels' message. Friends, what we face when we run into people who don't want to hear the truth and who rather want to fight us, we're running into the spiritual exercises of people that have sold their souls to the Pope of Rome.
Amen.
I was invited to speak in Page, Arizona, back in March of last year. I was supposed to give a week-long evangelistic series to the people of Page, Arizona. Well, then a person contacted the Biblical Research Institute at the General Conference. A man who was heading that would be considered a theologian, a teacher, or a scholar amongst us as a people. And the writer, the person said, would you please tell us what you know about Bill Hughes and his book, The Secret Terrorist? This man at the Biblical Research Institute of Seventh-day Adventists, this theologian, wrote back, and he basically was laughing as he said, oh, Bill Hughes thinks that the Catholic Church is behind war, and he thinks that the leaders of the world are under Rome's control, and he thinks that Bill Clinton was a Jesuit puppet. He said, Bill Hughes just doesn't know what he's talking about. And based on the authority, not on the authority of history and scripture and the spirit of prophecy, but based on the authority of a scholar theologian who was a warrior for the Pope, who had taken spiritual formation, they decided that Bill Hughes should not come to speak in Page, Arizona. Friends, this has permeated Seventh-day Adventism. This is paving the way right here for Seventh-day Adventists to embrace the mark of the beast.
Amen.
That's what this is involved with. Here are your three wavy lines. This is where the three wavy lines, that's where these came from. This is the BEM document that was signed in 1982 by all major churches throughout the world. They agreed on baptism, Eucharist, and ministry. Folks, do you realize that people died? They died during the 16th century and 17th century over the issue of baptism?
Amen.
Do you realize that? Felix Manz, a disciple of Ulrich Zwingli. Have you heard of Ulrich Zwingli?
Yes.
The famous Swiss theologian? Felix Manz, in 1527, decided he was going to be baptized by immersion. Shortly thereafter, Ulrich Zwingli, the great Swiss theologian, had Felix Manz drowned in a Swiss lake. Had him drowned. Why? Because he believed in baptism by immersion. The Eucharist, people died through the Dark Ages because they believed that those emblems were symbolic of Christ's body and blood. People died over that belief, folks. And ministry, all the churches that signed the BEM document with this as the sign or the symbol of that document, they said, we will no longer proselytize other churches. When we hold evangelistic meetings, we'll do them in our own churches, and then we will use satellite television to beam them out to other like churches. That's the evangelism that would be done. No longer have public halls and invite people from everywhere. No, people would be invited to their own church to listen to meetings that were being beamed by satellite TV. Could a Seventh-day Adventist agree to that? We signed it, folks. It was signed by a man named Raul Dederin. Raul Dederin, a Seventh-day Adventist theologian at Andrews University, raised a devout Catholic, became a Jesuit priest, and then was converted to Seventh-day Adventism. He signed the document.
His name again?
Raul Dederin. R-A-O-U-L-D-E-D-E-R-E-N. I went to Andrews a few years ago. I was allowed to stay at one of the teachers' homes. She was a single woman. She was leaving for the weekend. And so she said I could stay at her home. The people that invited me there knew this lady. So I come up to the lady's house with the folks that invited me. We come through the laundry room area, and as I walk in, this teacher's leaving. And she shakes my hand. I say, hi, ma'am, thanks for letting me use your house. She said, oh, no problem. I'll be back late Sunday night. You'll be gone Sunday morning, so everything's good. Folk, she said, you wrote some books, didn't you? I said, yes, ma'am, I've written a few books. She said, oh, yes. She said, one of the finest men that I have ever met used to be a Jesuit priest. And now he's a retired teacher here at Andrews University. I said, really, man, what's his name? She said, his name is Raoul Detterin. I said, oh, Raoul Detterin, the man who signed the BEM document.